Good evening. On behalf of the One Book Community Committee, welcome to this evening's presentation based on this year's selection of the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. The following people should be recognized for having served on our committee. Jane Brissett, who is our project coordinator, is in the back there. Carla Powers, the library manager, also standing in the back. Sally Anderson, Carol Kelly. Carol, if you'll stand or wave. Becky Ardren, Mark King, Nancy Eaton, Mary Lucarilla, Carla Harold, David Osey, Judy Sheriff, and Renee Zern. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Stephen Huddleston. Dr. Huddleston graduated from medical school at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. He completed his internship and residency at the University of Minnesota in general surgery. He received a PhD for research on the mechanism of chronic rejection of cardiac transplants. He was awarded a National Research Service Award from the National Institutes of Health in support of his research. He has multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, in addition to multiple abstracts and oral presentations at national scientific meetings. Currently, Dr. Huddleston is completing a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He will be joining St. Luke's Hospital this summer. In addition, his additional Duluth connection is his wife, Josie, who is a graduate of Duluth East High School and the University of Minnesota Medical School. They are parents of 3 young, energetic sons. And in addition to that, his in-laws, Tom and Teresa O'Gara, are present for this evening's presentation. So, Dr. Huddleston, the pressure is on. Thank you.
I just want to thank Rose for that introduction, and I am feeling the pressure. I also want to thank all of you for coming this evening when I know a lot of people were on break, and this should be, I think it'll power on in a second here. And I also want to just take this opportunity to thank the Duluth Public Library and the One Book, One Community organization, as well as the College of St. Scholastica for sponsoring the talk and giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm going to have to work on this for a second. Oh, it is. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Are you able to see that? Is there a way to turn the light down a little bit? I realize now, I didn't think about this earlier, but maybe... I'm
not sure which one it is.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about how Johns Hopkins relates to the book that you all read about Henrietta Lacks. Because it is a sensitive topic and I'm speaking on my own, I just want to have a disclaimer. I hate to do this, but anything I say is my personal thought or idea or opinion, and I'm not representing any official statement. So if I stick my foot in my mouth, it's me all by myself, and you can blame me and only me. So this story, this gut-wrenching and compelling story about Henrietta Lacks and her family is in the setting of the East Baltimore community and the medical center that was founded to serve that community, Johns Hopkins Hospital. She died tragically at a young age. She was born in a small rural area of Virginia in an old log cabin and married her first cousin, David Lacks, when she was 20 years old. They'd known each other since they were children. She actually had her first child when she was 14 years old and went on to have 5 children before she died shortly after delivering the the youngest child. She died in 1951 while she was under the care of a gynecologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Her life was actually, in many ways, very similar to the life of other women in her situation in East Baltimore during that time. And I can tell you from my personal experience taking care of patients from that neighborhood, the lives of her children are very similar to the lives of many families that live in that neighborhood, except for one very unique twist, and that is the fact that a sample taken from the cervical cancer that she had was able to be cultured in the laboratory at Johns Hopkins, and was the first cell culture that was continuously cultured, and for that reason we call it immortalized outside the human body. And these cells were obviously used for a myriad of different experiments that led to multiple scientific discoveries and achievements that have benefited the lives of many humans and saved the lives of many people since that time. I think it's important to note and to remember that she did not give permission for the cells to be removed. She probably was not aware, as far as we know, that the cells were removed. And this was customary at the time, that no consent might have been obtained. And it's just, I think, a major point that we have to consider when we discuss her story and when we consider her relationship and her care at Johns Hopkins as we go through this talk. Her family then found out in the 1970s, and this set the stage. They found out about all this stuff, and this really set the stage for the collision of two worlds that is the story that's told in the book. And this is a collision of two worlds that you can see when you go to visit or you work at Johns Hopkins. And it's a story that goes on for many patients and families that are cared for at Johns Hopkins, and for many of the caregivers that work there. This is a picture that I took on Broadway Street in Baltimore, several blocks from Johns Hopkins, and you can see in the background, this is the medical center, and there's a big, in block letters up here, you can't see it in the photograph, but it says Johns Hopkins. And this is on the corner of Broadway and Federal Street. And you can see all these row houses that are boarded up. And it goes on like this for blocks and blocks and blocks, miles and miles around the medical center. It's an enormous neighborhood that is suffering from a lot of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, abandonment of homes. And every once in a while, in one of these blocks, you will see a row house that is inhabited by a family. And there are some people that do live up in the boarded up row houses. But as you can imagine, with all the social issues that go along with this, any time a patient from that neighborhood comes into Johns Hopkins, there is sort of this collision of two worlds where when we try to provide care for them, a lot of other issues come up. So I want to talk about the context of the relationship of the Lax family with Johns Hopkins. And so I'm going to go through a history of Johns Hopkins, starting with the individual, Mr. Johns Hopkins, and talk about the mission of the hospital as it relates to research, education, and patient care. And then lastly, I'll talk about the impact of Johns Hopkins on the East Baltimore community, and how Johns Hopkins is working to improve access to health care. Johns Hopkins was a man who was born on a tobacco plantation in 1795. It was called Whitehall, and it's between Baltimore and Annapolis near the Severn River. It's a very pretty area and very fertile land. His family had been in the Church of England when they came to the colonies, but they later joined the Society of Friends after a proselytizing Quaker visited the region. So this would have been his great-grandparents that joined the Quaker faith. His first name is spelled with an S, and the reason for that is it was his great-grandmother's maiden name. And this is an unending source of confusion for pretty much anyone that has any encounter with the medical center. And nobody cares at the medical center if you call it Johns Hopkins. We know what you mean. A major turning point in his life occurred when he was 12 years old in 1807. That group of Quakers in that area at their meeting over a long period of time came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong, and many of them owned slaves, and they decided that they were going to have to free their slaves. And a few members of the society did hesitate. I think Johns Hopkins' family was one of them. And for a period of time, they were actually turned out of the meeting because they didn't seem to be going along with the decision that had been made. And then they changed their minds and came around. And so right around this time, many Quaker families in that area freed their slaves. Now, it wasn't like everybody left. A lot of the slaves that had been on their plantations were dependent on them for housing and food and care. And so, and also when you read about it, like reading the biography by his niece, which is where I got some of this information, they had a close relationship, almost like family, with many of the slave families. And so some slaves stayed, especially the older slaves, anybody with any disability who needed care, and they were given a place to live, and even some of them were given an allowance for the rest of their lives. This was a major turning point in Johns Hopkins' life. He was 12 years old, and there were no longer, all the slaves who could work pretty much did leave. And so in the family, everybody had to kind of pick up and carry the load, and so all the children were taken out of school and put to work, and at 12 years old, his education stopped. They did have the schoolmaster over for dinner on Saturday evenings fairly frequently, and he may have had some lessons then. Then, when he was 17 years old, he left the plantation and he went to Baltimore to work for his uncle, who was also named Jared. And they were working in shipping and trading dry goods. And the dry goods would be transported on Conestoga wagons. There were no railroads in the area at that time. And Baltimore was growing very rapidly, and the business did very well. Baltimore was founded in 1796, and within about 3 years it was within about 6 or 7 years, I think it was about the third largest city in the colonies, or in the country. During this time, Johns Hopkins fell in love with his first cousin, who was the daughter of the uncle that he was working for. And when they decided that they wanted to get married, they went to their uncle and the family and told them, and they were rebuked by them, and they forbade them to marry. And they were compliant with this, but they did write a letter. I think they wrote letters to each other. At least she wrote a letter to him pledging that she would always be there for him as a friend. And she never married after that, and he did not either. He continued to work for a brief period of time for his uncle, but then, who knows, possibly because of those personal reasons, but also possibly because they were having disagreements about how the business should be run, he ultimately decided to go into business on his own. And it wasn't completely, there wasn't a total falling out between them. He did get a $10,000 loan from his uncle, as well as some other pretty significant loans from some other relatives, and he started trading in whiskey. This was something that came about because there was a shortage of cash at the time among the people that they were trading with in that area of the colonies, and they had wanted, these people that they were trading dry goods with wanted to use whiskey instead of cash. And his uncle Jared didn't want to go along with it. He said that they were selling souls into perdition. But he still supported Johns Hopkins and gave him this personal loan, and business was very good, and it flourished. He made a lot of money. That's where his fortune really started to grow. And then he also became an investor in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He owned, I think he had controlling stock in it for quite a period of time. And he was also involved with banking, several banks in Baltimore, and was on their boards and made a lot of money. And he was also a lender privately to many small businessmen in the Baltimore area. He was especially well known for taking on high-risk loans. People who couldn't get a loan from the bank, he would give them, a few $1,000s to start their business, and he got a great reputation for that and made a lot of money doing it. He didn't have any heirs, and I think towards the end of his life probably started to think about what legacy he would leave. And it's really unclear what his motives were exactly, but he ultimately decided that he wanted to leave his fortune to establish a university and a hospital in Baltimore. And he did this by forming two corporations in 1867, and this would have been 6 years before he died. When he did this, he paid a lot of attention to the details relating to the deal, and this was characteristic of the business deals that he had made previously. And I just want to read. This is from his autobiography, not autobiography, but the biography that his niece wrote. This is from a letter regarding a land deal that he was going to make. He says, "My valued friend, I thank thee kindly for the promptness with which thee has responded to my request regarding the Brady farm, and have made up my mind to ask thee to make the purchase. Say $50 per acre, the land, of course, to be measured. I propose to pay 1/2 in cash, and if convenient to the seller, to pay the remainder in 12 months with interest. I think he should make no charge for any crop that may be in the ground, nor for any manure there may be in the barnyard. Possession to be given as early as possible, no later than the 1st of March. So he was really well known for being frugal and having great attention to detail in every business dealing. And this continued with his letter to the Board of Trustees at Johns Hopkins. He was very specific about the goal and the mission of the hospital. And this is in the book about Henrietta Lacks, a portion of it is, but I also want to include a bit of it here. He wrote to the board, "You will also provide for the reception of a limited number of patients who are able to make compensation for the room and attention they may require. The money received from such persons will enable you to appropriate a larger sum for the relief of the sufferings of that class which I directed to admit free of charge. And you will thus be enabled to afford to strangers and to those of your own people who have no friends or relations to care for them in sickness and who are not objects of charity, the advantages of careful and skillful treatment. It will be your special duty to secure for the service of the hospital surgeons and physicians of the highest character and greatest skill." So with this charge, the Board of Trustees recruited two leaders who were very important in the development of the university and the hospital. Daniel Coit Gilman was a Yale-trained leader in education who had been the president of the University of California, and he was brought to Baltimore to be the first president of the university. And his partner in leading the medical center was John Shaw Billings, who had been a Army surgeon who was very forward-thinking in the design of hospitals during the Civil War. And it related to the idea about how infection was spread. At that time, they thought that infection was primarily airborne. And so this was incorporated into their thinking about how to design hospitals. Now, the first job of these two gentlemen was to begin recruiting people for the medical school and for the hospital. And they were somewhat restricted in what they could do as far as building the medical center, in that only interest and dividends from the endowment that had been left for them could be used for either recruiting physicians or for building the buildings themselves. They weren't allowed to go into the trust at all to build the medical center. So it was slow going at first. They did recruit some physicians. And this is a famous painting that hangs in the library at Johns Hopkins, and it's the Welch Library. And these are professors. I'm going to try and use this pointer here. Oh, yeah, here. So these are professors Welch, who was a pathologist, Halsted, who was a surgeon, Osler, who was a professor of medicine, and Kelly, who was a gynecologist. They had a lot of influence over the early medical center, and this still goes on today. One of the interesting things about this portrait is the way Halsted is kind of dark, back in the shadows where it's kind of dark. And he was an interesting and controversial figure who was not particularly liked by some of the other physicians, but who Welch had kind of brought along. to help make some innovations in surgery. I'm going to discuss each of these leaders, except for Kelly too much, as I go through talking about the major tenets of the mission of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. But before I do that, I want to tell you this painting reminds me of a joke about physicians and surgeons. If you're in healthcare, you may have heard this joke. It's about duck hunting. There were 4 physicians who went duck hunting, and the internist heard a duck, break out of the bushes and fly across the sky, and it was quacking, and he said, "It sounds like a duck, and it looks like a duck because it's flying," but he hesitated because he wasn't sure, and he was trying to think of a good test to make sure that it was a duck. And then the gynecologist obstetrician started to draw up his shotgun, but then he realized that the duck might be pregnant, and he hesitated. The surgeon, without hesitation, quickly shot the duck out of the sky, and it plunged to the ground, and there was silence as the dog brought the duck to them, and he handed it to the pathologist, and he says, "What is this?" So that it makes light of the different roles or characteristics of different specialists. But there actually is some thought that maybe the characteristics of these early leaders in medicine and surgery may have somehow influenced their fields. The first area that I wanted to talk about was research at Johns Hopkins, and this is especially pertinent to the book. And I was trying to find a good photograph as an introduction to this topic, and I was looking for pictures of laboratories. And you're probably wondering why I chose this picture. Well, laboratories are actually boring, and research buildings are actually even more boring. But I thought this was a really important photograph because it shows a person who was critical to a major discovery in heart surgery, and that was this man here, Vivien Thomas. And this was taken with his family on the steps of Tennessee State College when he was working in Nashville at Vanderbilt University under a heart surgeon there named Alfred Blalock. And at the time this photograph would have been taken, he had been perfecting a surgical technique in the laboratory, which had not been done before, and which he had basically developed on his own with some collaboration with Dr. Blalock, but really the technical aspects of it were perfected by this man, Vivien Thomas. And he would not know the impact of this at that time. In fact, he was doing it for a set of experiments that they basically thought were failed experiments because they didn't see the difference they were looking for. But they had kind of tucked this away and then moved to Baltimore. And then it became really critical to a major discovery in cardiac surgery. Before I get more into that, I want to talk about this gentleman, William Henry Welch, who I showed you in that first picture of the 4 fathers of medicine. Welch was a pathologist. He was a 3rd-generation physician from Connecticut who got his degree at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York and was really unsatisfied with his training there, and then went on to study in Germany. He really believed in bedside teaching, and this was unique to his experience in Germany, although he had had some of it in New York. And he also was able to obtain his first microscope, which was not common among medical students and physicians at that time in the United States. And they really didn't have pathological laboratories. He just established the first pathological laboratory when he came back from Germany to Bellevue in New York in the late 1800s. And he was really well known for this. And Welch actually met this gentleman that I showed you here previously, John Shaw Billings. They met while they were in Germany, both traveling, and kind of connected there. And Welch became very interested in coming to Johns Hopkins ultimately. But before that, he had to come back to New York, and that's when he established that pathological laboratory. So he was critical to research, and when he was before he came to Hopkins, or right after he came to Hopkins, he was writing a letter to his father, and in that letter he said that the University, Hopkins, will have a splendid pathological laboratory and will afford great opportunities for original investigations. And his dream has really been achieved at the medical center. They lead the nation in research and development, and as well as federal funding, and they've had over 20 current or former School of Medicine scientists who were Nobel laureates. I just want to take a step back and put that in some frame of reference as you think about the book about Henrietta Lacks and how research is performed. A lot of people have a concept of academic research that's more like a corporate model, where they imagine that there are a group of bosses or a boss in charge of the medical center, and they have a lot of capital and resources that they draw upon, and then they delegate tasks to different researchers to carry these things out, and that somehow the institution just gets a bunch of money from the federal government and other sources to do that. And that's not how it works at all. It's not a top-down corporate model. A different way to think about it that I think is more accurate as like a bunch of small business people who are loosely associated with one another. And they get their funding from the federal government, and then these cogs in the wheel would be all of us researchers who are learning about normal biology and disease, and then using that to make discoveries about ways to prevent disease and ways to treat it. Each of these academic researchers has their own budget, which they get from funding from different sources. Basically, it's catch as catch can, and everybody's out, on their own trying to find some funding for their research. They manage that budget on their own, and they hire their own employees to do the research and to generate results and data. And then hopefully, in the end, this leads to a better, longer life for all of us. The way this works, at the ground level, going from bench to bedside, can be portrayed by this one example that I brought up already when I was talking about Vivien Thomas. He was involved in a surgical treatment for this disease called tetralogy of Fallot. Without hopefully not causing everyone's eyes to glaze over, I'll just briefly describe how a normal heart works. Basically, blood returns from your body into your heart and then is pumped to your lungs. And this blood does not have any oxygen or has very low levels of oxygen in it. When the blood goes to the lungs, it gets oxygen in it, and then it comes back to the muscular part of your heart and is pumped out to your body. That's in a normal heart. In babies with tetralogy of Fallot, they have a large hole between the side of the heart that receives the unoxygenated blood and the side of the heart that's supposed to be pumping oxygenated blood out to the body. So what happens is the blood that has not got oxygen in it in those babies can go out to the other side of the heart and be pumped out to the body, and that's why these babies are blue, or they call them blue babies. The reason not much blood goes to the lungs is because there's also a blockage of the artery that goes from the heart to the lungs. You can imagine back at the time that this condition was originally recognized. Well, Fallot was a French physician, I don't know, probably in the 1800s, who first described this. And there were clinics full of these children who there was basically no real treatment for. And Helen Taussig was a young cardiologist. She was actually appointed head of the pediatric cardiac clinic at Johns Hopkins when she was just 3 years out of medical school in 1930. And she had a clinic full of these children who all would ultimately die if she didn't come up with a solution for this. And she had some vague idea of how this condition could be corrected by somehow making a connection between this circulation that goes out to the body and the circulation here that goes to the lungs, which would bypass this obstruction here. But she didn't know quite how to do it. And interestingly, after she went to a surgeon in Boston who kind of just declined to help her and didn't really have any ideas. And right around that time is when Dr. Blaylock was recruited to Hopkins to take over surgery. He was chief of surgery at Hopkins. He brought with him Vivien Thomas, whose picture I showed you, and Vivien Thomas had already perfected an operation in dogs that would treat this and would make that connection between the systemic circulation and the circulation to the lungs. They didn't quite realize this until they all put their ideas together when Helen Taussig came to them, and they planned to start doing this operation, but Dr. Blaylock was head of surgery at Hopkins, and he was busy with many other things, and they came up with this plan where Vivien Thomas was going to teach Dr. Blaylock how to do the operation. So he taught him, he observed him doing it one time, and then Dr. Blaylock performed the procedure, I think just 2 times on a dog. And then another child who they had been kind of watching started to become quite sick. Her name was baby Eileen. And they decided that they were going to have to go ahead and Dr. Blaylock was going to have to perform this operation. Now, he had only done this twice on a dog. And he actually was able to perform the operation. And the development of all this is described in Vivien Thomas's autobiography, which is called Partners of the Heart. It's a fascinating read, and I recommend it. There is a lot of technical information in it. I actually found it very interesting from the perspective of being a cardiac surgery fellow, and I wasn't able to spend much time on the technical details, but I'll probably, to be quite honest, just to give you an idea of what a great technician Vivien Thomas was, I'll probably go back and reread some of the parts to learn some tricks that he describes in there. But in any event, this book tells this story and how they collaborated together. And everybody always wants to know, well, did Dr. Blaylock do it or did Vivien Thomas do it? Who gets the credit? Whose idea was this? It's called, today this operation is called a Blaylock-Taussig shunt, named after Dr. Blaylock and Dr. Taussig, the cardiologist. And I would definitely conclude that that's not fair. Vivien Thomas played a great role in that. He has been since recognized and was given an honorary doctorate of laws by Johns Hopkins. He has a portrait that hangs in the Blaylock building among many giants in surgery. He's very well known, and they made an HBO movie about this story. You can see this is a photograph of the Blue Baby operation. And you can see Vivien Thomas standing over the shoulder of Dr. Blaylock. And there are many people who were at the operation at the time, including Dr. Cooley and Dr. Longmire, who were residents at the time. And they have since also confirmed accounts that Dr. Thomas was critical to the success of those early operations. Now, baby Eileen only lived about a year after the surgery, but it's a lot longer than she would have lived without it, and many babies after that did live longer and lived long enough for the development of cardiopulmonary bypass when they could ultimately have a complete repair of their tetralogy of Fallot. So Vivien Thomas, really transcended a lot of barriers to serve humankind and saved countless lives. And I asked myself as I was reading his autobiography, how did he do this? At a time, the 1930s and 1940s. And I think it gets back to the type of individual he was and the background he came from. He had a strong, loving family, commitment to education, strong work ethic. He was very professional in all of his interactions at work. He was not averse to risk, moving his family from Nashville to Baltimore, and sometimes working for much less than he would have made in construction, which was his original field. He had apprenticed under his father from the age of 13. He only had a high school education, but he had a lot of respect for education, and he'd worked very hard at that. He was humble, and he always had a positive attitude. I just want to read a few passages from his autobiography so you can get a feeling for the type of person he was and the family he came from. He says, "My mother and father raised the 5 of us in this house. Our father worked endlessly to supply the family needs. He had a great sense of humor, and we children often attempted to take advantage of this characteristic. He was considerate and generally indulgent, but lost no time in letting us know that he and our mother were the authorities whose rules were to be obeyed. My mother, who was an excellent seamstress," that's probably where Vivien Thomas got his talents, "took very good care of us. She made all of our clothes for the girls, and when we boys were growing up, she made our shirts, pants, and suits. She also had the endless task of feeding all of us. When we were teenagers, we 3 boys would eat all the food in sight, and as a result, if for any reason my father was not at the dinner table, my mother would put his food aside before we sat down to eat. Knowing how much food we devoured, I have wondered in later years why our father did not have us pay something toward the grocery bill. He referred to us as the wrecking crew where food was concerned." And then regarding education, I just want to read this brief passage. "The teachers in the public schools were concerned and dedicated. They were determined that children would learn whatever they were supposed to learn while attending their classes. By today's standards, there was an almost unbelievable cooperation between parents and teachers. Teachers would contact parents, parents would contact teachers. Discussions might concern classwork, cooperation of the pupil, areas where the pupil needed more help, effort put forth by the pupil to learn, home assignments, and the like. Discipline was seldom a school problem. It was taken care of at home. There were no habitually disruptive pupils in classrooms. They simply were not tolerated." You can tell it was a different time, and Vivien Thomas is a product of that, and a unique leader for whom we're very fortunate to have had in the field of cardiac surgery. Today, human research obviously continues. It's much different. At that time, I'm sure they did not get consent from baby Eileen's family. And I'm sure they had no idea that Dr. Blaylock had only performed the surgery a few times on dogs. But things are different now, and you know, if anything is going to be done, it has to be approved by an institutional review board, as I know you heard from Dr. Sandy about this. And there are kind of two ways to do the IRB approval. There's a formal IRB approval that you have to do for a study that is going to involve possibly some procedures that would be performed on patients. And then you even have to get IRB approval if you're going to do a retrospective chart review, where nothing new will be done. You're simply going to be going back to look in patients' charts. But even to do that, you have to get IRB approval. And a lot of this is because the Health Information Privacy and Portability Act, or HIPAA, as we all know it, you have to always think of protecting a patient's identity. And then the other thing is informed consent. Now, obviously, we have to get informed consent for any treatment as well as any research that's going to be done these days. And this sounds all well and good, but I want you to understand a little bit about what this really means. This is a consent form for a fairly straightforward research project involving cardiac surgery patients, and it doesn't involve anything being done to them that would not have been done otherwise. It's 7 pages long and fine print, single-spaced. And this is not the only authorization or consent form that a patient would be placed with. I figured in my head last night exactly what the patients I am seeing would be signing for consent. If they come in through the emergency department, they'll sign a general consent to treatment form. They'll have to sign some financial forms. Then if they went to the cardiac catheterization lab, which most patients who are going to have surgery for one reason or another might have to do, they would sign a 2-page consent form for that, as well as a blood transfusion consent form if they would need one. That's 5 pages at this point, because the cardiac catheterization is 2 pages long. If they have surgery, they're going to have to read another 2-page consent form for that, and then they also have to sign another blood consent form. They have to sign an anesthesia consent, and if they will end up in the ICU, and if they need any other procedures done, they'll have to sign an ICU procedural consent form. So that's 10 pages plus these 7 pages. And I think you just need to think about for a minute what it's like for a person coming from that area in East Baltimore who, you know, where oral legend has it that, you know, Hopkins has been snatching people off the streets for, you know, 100 years and doing experiments on them. And a person who comes from a very poor educational background, where they may have not finished grade school or high school, where they may be barely literate or not literate at all. And imagine what it's like for them when they're ill. They could be having a heart attack, and then you're trying to go through all this with them. And I think at the end of the day, it's, you know, it definitely is important for us to have laws in place, and it's important for us to have IRBs and consent forms. But what it really boils down to on the practical level, if you're going to care for patients, and especially if you're going to do any research that involves patients, is it involves the physician or the surgeon sitting down on the edge of the bed, having a conversation, establishing a relationship, looking them in the eye, and caring for them, and making sure that that patient feels that they are cared for. One of the other important tenets of the mission of Johns Hopkins is education. This is a photograph of the first graduating class of the Johns Hopkins Medical School, and this is Dr. Welch, or Professor Welch, right in the middle with all of his German influence. One thing you'll notice about this first graduating medical class is that they're all men, except for this one, and women would come later. Dr. Welch actually, you know, he was influenced a lot by the Germans, and I'm totally serious about that. On a second trip to Europe, he noticed that there were a lot of women in the lectures, and it wasn't long after that, when he came back to Johns Hopkins, that women were admitted to the medical school. And as you know, I talked about Helen Talsik. She graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School and was given a lot of responsibility early on in her medical career. So you have to understand a little bit of what medical education was like at that time. At most medical schools in the United States, it was kind of spurious, and it wasn't well organized. Anybody could start a medical school. I could start a medical school. And you just start charging people, and they would come to your lectures. And the idea was that the more people you had taking your lectures, the more money you would make. So that caused people to kind of lower their admission standards, and pretty much anyone who had the money could take medical school classes. There was very little clinical teaching, and as I had told you previously, not much in the way of understanding of pathology. You know, people didn't go look in the microscope at specimens. Now, Hopkins was trying to set a higher standard, and so they had high entrance requirements. They encouraged a knowledge of foreign languages. travel in Europe. They grounded it all in a basic science foundation, and they tried to build an environment that fostered research. And they really believed in bedside teaching. And this is Sir William Osler. At this time, he was just Professor Osler. And it shows him in a series of 4 photographs, first observing the patient, then auscultating or listening through his stethoscope, was a newfangled instrument at that time, and then palpating and then contemplating to determine the diagnosis. Now, Osler and also Welch were big fans of bedside teaching, and I just wanted to read a passage from a biography of William Henry Welch about one of his bedside teaching experiences when he was a medical student in New York. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, "I continue to minister to the sick at the hospital daily, breaking, Mr. Olcott says, the commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill.' I must tell you of a good story. You remember the old woman in the last ward who had an ovarian tumor. The other morning, as the doctors went into the ward, we noticed that she looked smiling and unusually happy. A brown paper bundle lay upon the small table by her bed. We asked her what made her so happy. She said that she had received a present from her brother-in-law and wanted us to look at it. We opened the package, and what do you think the gift was? It was her shroud. She said it cost $10 and wanted to know how we liked it. Of course, we thought it would be very becoming, but told her that she would not have any occasion to use it for a long time, we hoped. It seemed to have the most exhilarating influence upon her. She stood well in operation." So, this is just one humorous anecdote about where they were rounding on a patient, and the patient showed them the shroud for her funeral that her brother-in-law had sent her. But I think it highlights kind of the low expectations for healthcare at that time. Hopefully we're setting the bar a little higher now. So this is Sir William Osler, who was born in the backwoods of Canada in a small town about 40 miles north of Toronto. And he then went on to be trained in Canada and worked for a while at McGill and then the University of Pennsylvania before he was recruited to Johns Hopkins. And he believed that every doctor in the hospital should be a teacher. He really believed in bedside teaching. And he also was a strong proponent of compassion and care, believed that qualities of the heart were as important as qualities of the mind, although he was very sharp and known as a great diagnostician. He isn't really known for having ever discovered anything, but he was a great teacher and he was great at obtaining the diagnosis. He also wrote the first comprehensive textbook of medicine, The Principles and Practice of Medicine, and it was really the first textbook written by one person to try and cover all topics in internal medicine, and it became the Bible, so to speak, for physicians at that time. And he was really the last person to do that by themselves. Today, the medical school at Johns Hopkins is ranked very highly. There's a strong tradition of bedside rounds and teaching. And there are many residencies and fellowships. Now, the idea of residency was really set forth and developed by this man, William Stewart Halsted, who was the head of surgery at Johns Hopkins. And as I mentioned, there was kind of a dark side to Halsted. He was brilliant and hardworking, and he developed several techniques that are important in surgery, like gentle handling of tissues, precise anatomic dissection with control of bleeding. Before him, people just went at it with a knife and, not respecting anatomic planes, and surgery was messy and dangerous and bloody. And he developed many of these techniques and principles which today we sort of take for granted. He also perfected the first technique for sewing two ends of bowel together, and he began to study cocaine as a topical anesthetic, and this allowed him to do a lot of surgeries using cocaine as a topical anesthetic, which previously could not be done, especially things like head and neck surgery, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, in developing this as a topical anesthetic, he started using it and he became addicted to cocaine. And really, probably for most of his career, he remained addicted to it. He was hospitalized twice. Unfortunately, for one of the hospitalizations, which I believe was in Providence, Rhode Island, at that time, the treatment to cure your cocaine addiction was to get you addicted to heroin or morphine. So after that, he was addicted to both. And he would often disappear into his office for about an hour and a half in the afternoon and then come out full of energy. I actually have been told by some of my attendings, if I thought things were bad, imagine if my boss was on cocaine. And And he's right. I think Halsted was a bear to work for. And when I say, that maybe some of these traditions and personalities that were set forth by these founding fathers have been passed on, it does seem sometimes that they are passed on today. This is how it works, though, in the Halsted residency, which is based on the idea of graduated responsibility, whereas you start out as an intern and you aren't doing too much, and then gradually your responsibility and what you're trusted with and what you actually do progresses through the years. This is my counterpart, Greg Rushing, who's the other cardiothoracic surgery fellow who started with me, and he's doing a heart transplant here, his first heart transplant under the direction of Dr. Vicella. This was during our first year. Dr. Vicella is one of our great teachers who also does a lot of congenital cardiac surgery. This is a echocardiogram. The next thing I want to talk about is patient care, and I thought I'd start off by talking to you about a very extraordinary case that I was involved in. This is an echocardiogram of a patient who was a 65-year-old African-American woman who had had a infection in the main valve in her heart that leads from the heart out to the rest of the body. This is called the aortic valve. And she had had an infection there back in the 1990s, and at that time her valve had to be removed and it was replaced with a mechanical valve. And she then went on, this was early in the 90s, and continued to live her life. She was a mother and then retired. And when we saw her, she had been admitted to an outside hospital with signs of a recurrent infection. And when they studied her heart using sound waves, this echocardiogram, they found that this heart valve that had been placed surgically before, which had been down here, right where this is the heart, this is the main blood vessel that comes out of the heart, where blood flows out to your body. This valve had been sewn in here, but it had come loose and it had moved downstream, and this was due to a chronic infection. She was growing bacteria in her blood. This is an extremely dangerous situation, and she was at risk for this rupturing, in which case she could bleed, and a hematoma or collection of blood could have crushed her heart and not allowed it to fill, and could have been, a fulminant death. Or she could have also developed heart failure, where blood leaking back around this would have gone in and caused her heart to dilate, and it could have damaged her heart. This sort of infection can also cause problems with the conduction of electrical rhythms through the heart and can lead to heart block. This is a very dangerous situation. She was admitted to an outside hospital that does a lot of cardiac surgery, and they evaluated this patient, and after thinking things over, decided that they thought she was too high risk for surgery and that they wouldn't be able to operate her. The doctors taking care of her then contacted the head of cardiac surgery at Johns Hopkins and asked if he would take on the case. And we never say no. And she was brought to our hospital, and by the time she got to us shortly thereafter, she was going into severe heart failure and had to be placed on a breathing machine. And I had to call her daughter and get permission to do the operation, for us to do the operation. And I'll never forget talking to her daughter on the phone, and I was very honest about how grave this situation was and how dangerous the operation was, being a redo operation, cutting through scar, and then dealing with this infection. And she gave permission, of course, and we proceeded with surgery. And it was a very long and difficult operation, and it was performed mostly by our head of cardiac surgery. And I just assisted him in this, but it was one of many very difficult operations that I've seen him perform on very poor and disadvantaged patients. And he was able to dissect this heart out and get the patient on the heart-lung bypass machine. And then we entered this area where the infection was, and we found frank pus in there surrounding the root of her heart. And we were able to remove all that and debride that, and we took out this valve, which is basically what had happened was this main blood vessel that comes out of the heart had basically completely separated from the root of the heart. And we removed all of that tissue. And then what he did to repair that and to replace it was there's this material that you can obtain. It's basically a heart valve and root obtained from a cadaver, somebody who's donated their body after they died, but before their body was embalmed or preserved. They donated that tissue, and that was then preserved. We call it cryopreservation. And this tissue can last, the expiration dates are like on the order of 10 years or so, probably 5 to 10, more than 5 years, 10 years, because I look at the expiration dates, and we hang on to them for a long time. And we use that tissue to basically reconstruct this entire part of her heart. And it sounds beautiful and elegant, and it looks great going in, but I'll tell you, once you come off the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, it turns into a nightmare, and it was very difficult drying things up. There's a lot of bleeding for some reason with these type of operations, but we kept at it, and we got through it, and we were able to get her out of the operating room. We had to leave her chest open for a couple days with packing in there to stop the bleeding, but she actually did quite well. We took her back a couple days later, closed the chest, and then she was in the hospital for about 2 weeks. She probably could have gone to rehab sooner than that. She didn't have any major complications, did really very well, and looked a lot better after surgery than she did before, and she was very grateful. So I think this is just an extraordinary story, and it's one of many, many, many similar stories that I've been involved with similar types of patients that are really remarkable, and that I've had, it's been an honor for me to participate in them, and I've learned a lot from it, not just about cardiac surgery, but also about people and relationships and taking care of patients. These are some of the admission statistics from Johns Hopkins Hospital taken from the year before this biography of Johns Hopkins was published. And it just demonstrates that just as Johns Hopkins was started as a charity hospital to serve the community, it remained that way. And these just show you that about half the patients treated in the year 1927 and 1928 were black. It was a very active and busy hospital, but it's interesting to me to look at these numbers and statistics compared to today and realize how the hospital actually wasn't that big and wasn't that busy compared to the numbers that you see today. Now it's a $6.5 billion integrated health system. It involves multiple academic and community hospitals, several surgery centers, several primary care clinics, over 1,000 beds at the main hospital, and one of the nearby community hospitals that is run by Hopkins has 500 beds. And then there's also an international presence. Hopkins has hospitals, affiliations, or acquisitions in the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. And some Hopkins physicians go and work in those areas as well. There are over 50,000 worldwide employees, or 35,000, I guess, now, and over 20,000 within Baltimore, which makes it the largest employer within Baltimore. There's a lot of new construction going on at Hopkins, and that results in a lot of jobs in Baltimore and in the area. Hopkins also keeps track of how many of their construction products or goods and services that they purchase are from companies that are run by minorities or women, and it's an extraordinarily high percentage. And the fact that they even keep track of that, I think, is remarkable. What's East Baltimore like today? Well, there's a lot of poverty. There's still a lot of housing abandonment, as I showed you in that first photograph, unemployment. There are really no shops or stores. I actually lived right next to Hopkins for the first 2 weeks I was out there. My family wasn't able to come out yet, and I was out there on my own. And so I found this place near the medical center. I didn't live in one of those boarded up buildings, actually, but I was across the street from that sort of stuff. And it's a place where patients and families sometimes stay, or visiting fellows from other countries. And I stayed there for a couple weeks, and so I got to know the neighborhood a little bit. And I remember just wanting to buy groceries, and I asked a woman who lives in the neighborhood, who was across the street, when I was at a filling station there, and I asked her if there was a grocery store nearby. I really didn't want to drive. I would have preferred to have walked. And she really couldn't think of one. There wasn't any grocery store nearby, And so when you think about basic things like nutrition, when you think about, what do children write on? What do they play with? I don't know, because there's nothing around there for them to buy, to do that. They can't even get to those sorts of resources, let alone do they even have the money for it. It's very poor health status. The life expectancy in the neighborhood in East Baltimore is about 20 years less than it is in the United States, which is on par with a third world country. And then, as you can imagine, problems with the educational system, drug abuse, and crime. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm showing you this nice picture of all these pretty new row houses and a green lawn while I'm telling you such a dismal story. And that's because there is this East Baltimore Development Initiative, which is privately driven, but really supported a great deal by Hopkins as well as the city of Baltimore. And it involves the neighborhood immediately surrounding the medical center. It's probably the largest urban redevelopment initiative in the country that's going on right now. Hopkins really does do a lot for the community. They provide, in 2010, they provided $208 million in uncompensated care, $65 million of that to Baltimore residents. Uncompensated care includes charity care as well as care that they just write off because they can't collect it. There are many patients who would probably be eligible for charity care, but even with the help of a financial counselor, they're not able to get the necessary paperwork turned in. If patients receive care at Hopkins and then they don't pay their bills, Hopkins explores it to some degree to see if they can pay their bills, but if it looks like they're not going to, then they just drop it, and that's why this figure is so large. Even when patients don't pay their bills, let's say it's not charity care, but they just didn't pay their bills. If they come back to the hospital, they still get more care. And a lot of these patients come through the emergency department. This is a major problem around there and in our country. Hopkins has kind of embraced it, and they've increased the resources dedicated to their emergency department, while many other urban medical centers in the United States have kind of tried to not shut the doors, but decrease the financial damage to their institution through the ER. Patients who aren't able to pay typically would come through the ER, whereas outpatients who have good, maintenance health care, good outpatient care, who see a doctor regularly, would tend to not come to the ER. Another thing I wanted to tell you about was, and I did mention briefly, was all the goods and services that Hopkins purchases from the surrounding community and how many jobs this supports. And then another two aspects of clinical care I wanted to talk about were primary care, which there are many primary care clinics which will help patients, and also this Charm City Clinic is a free clinic that's run by medical students, supervised by attendings in the city, that provides free care basically to patients, and doesn't just help them with their health care, but actually helps them navigate these institutions. I think you'll remember from the book about Henrietta Lacks, there's a couple times where they talk about the daughter, Deborah, calls up the Hopkins hospital operator to ask them for information about HeLa cells. And that was, reading that to me, it was very sad and gut-wrenching to hear that and to imagine what that interaction must have been like. For one thing, it's actually kind of interesting. If she called the Hopkins operator, she was probably talking to somebody from her neighborhood there in East Baltimore. And they certainly would not have known where to direct her or who to tell her to talk to. But it just demonstrates the inability of many of these families to navigate these complex and ominous appearing institutions. And Hopkins is right there in the middle of it, so that's the one that they're butting up against most frequently. Charm City Clinic is this medical student-run clinic which helps patients who it takes care of navigate these large institutions and all this paperwork and all these social services. The Access Partnership is for specialty care. The head of the Clinical Practice Association is our former head of cardiac surgery, Dr. Bill Baumgartner, who is a really well-known cardiac surgeon in the United States, former president of the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, and the current president of the American Board of Thoracic Surgery. He's a very busy man, and he's also involved in the leadership at Hopkins. But as part of his job as head of the Clinical Practice Association, which is basically all the specialists at Hopkins, he conceived of an idea called the Access Partnership, where patients can pay between $10 and $20 one-time fee, and then they can see any of the specialists at Hopkins and get all their care taken care of. And all of the attendings, the specialist attendings, were in favor of this. It had unanimous support to basically not charge for their services. And this brings us back to the letter to the Board of Trustees, which I brought up a couple times, and as I said, it was mentioned in the book. The letter to the Board of Trustees is something that I was already familiar with before reading the book, because it's brought up frequently by the leadership at Hopkins when they're coming up with ideas and policies and new programs. And it's also brought up not at the top leadership, but at the lower departmental and divisional level. When I came to Hopkins as a cardiothoracic surgery fellow. Within my first week there, I received an email from our head of cardiac surgery, the same man who did that operation that I described to you, and it was a copy of the letter from Johns Hopkins to the Board of Trustees for us to read and think about. And this is just another passage from that. The indigent sick of this city and its environs, without regard to sex, age, or color, who may require surgical or medical treatment, and who can be received into the hospital without peril to the other inmates and the poor of this city and state of all races who are stricken down by any casualty shall be received into the hospital without charge for such periods of time and under such regulations as you may prescribe. It sounds nice, but it's not perfect. And there are problems regarding race and socioeconomic status and access to care. But Hopkins has actually been a leader in research in this area. This is a letter from the New England, this is an article, an original article from the New England Journal, which was published by an anesthesiologist at Hopkins in the 1970s. Now, things were different back then. I don't want to scare anyone who ends up in an academic medical center. Nowadays, you know, interns and residents are supervised from day one very closely. No one performs any operations by themselves that they haven't seen before or that they just did on a dog. Not even the attendings. But you know, nowadays where things are very well supervised, back at that time, the attendings had their private service, and then there might be what was called a ward service. And patients might end up on the ward service and be operated on by a resident, and the attending may not be present or present only for a brief period of time. And this anesthesiologist at Hopkins did a study looking at the likelihood of whether or not a patient would be assigned to the resident or the ward service, and he found that black patients were 2 to 4 times more likely than white patients to be under the care of surgeons in training. This paper generated a lot of discussion at the time, but the topic has not gone away, and there continues to be, even though things are different with training today, there continues to be a lot of research with regards to racial and socioeconomic issues. This is a young trauma surgeon whose office is just down the hall from me, and he's really great man who's doing a lot of interesting research. He's also a very good trauma surgeon, and I've seen him save a lot of lives. Really great person to work with. But his area of research that he's interested in addition to his medical degree as a master's in public health, and he's looked at race and insurance status related to trauma mortality, and he's found that blacks and Hispanics and people who are uninsured have a higher risk of dying after a trauma. And a lot of this there isn't a great explanation for. He's also shown that they have higher mortality in their care after trauma. And they have a higher likelihood of not being discharged to a rehab facility. In other words, patients who may need additional care after they leave the hospital, minorities often end up at home without that additional care. One really interesting study that he looked at was a survey of medical students, and they used an implicit preference or bias survey to detect implicit bias and preference, and they found that medical students typically had implicit preference or bias for people in a higher socioeconomic class and white people. And you know, I think you can draw different sorts of conclusions from that type of research. One would be that medical students are bad people. But I don't think it's that simple and that straightforward. And I think, you know, that it's a complex problem, and our understanding of that will lead to some sort of more, you know, a complex solution. But I think that Hopkins is a place where they're kind of on the cutting edge of that, and they're staying ahead of it, and they're doing things to address these issues. One of them is establishing an Office of Diversity and Cultural Competence, which is kind of a new thing, and they have specific goals set out over a specific period of time for recruiting and retaining minorities in leadership positions and addressing some of these barriers to access and healthcare disparities. So that's pretty much all I have to say. You know, I just want to emphasize those points again, that you know, this story, it does it brings up a lot of conflict and issues between a community that's really struggling and needs help and an institution that appears to be thriving and doing really well. But I just, you know, I kind of hope that people understand that the the physicians and the surgeons and all the people that work at that medical center are really doing it for a higher ideal, and they're trying to help people. So I guess I'll take questions for as long as anybody wants to ask questions. Yes, sir.
Would you like to comment on the present government program for health care, commonly called voluntary?
I'm not going to comment too directly on that. I think that you know, health care is a human right, and I think that's probably the first issue that we need to sort out of as a society. When everybody's on agreement on that, I think the solution will be much more clear.
Can you talk a little bit about, you made reference to the oral history of blacks being kidnapped off the street for experiments. Is there any basis for that oral history, or?
Not directly related to Hopkins. I think probably Dr. Sandy talked a little bit about the Tuskegee incident. So there was this series of experiments at Tuskegee, and I'm not sure the exact time that this took place, but basically they were observing patients who had syphilis at a time when there was a known treatment for syphilis. This was curable, and this was not at Hopkins, but they were just observing them and learning about the natural history, which is a violation of their human rights and you know, violation of the Nuremberg trials recommendations, which were not law, but you know, it was awful. And I think, and then I think that, and then I think the history of using human cadavers for dissection. And there is kind of a dark history there in the medical profession. You know, in different periods of time, people have stolen cadavers without permission to dissect them, to learn about human anatomy. I think that would contribute to it. And those, you know, cadavers that would have been stolen for those purposes probably would have been people who were either poor or minorities. But at Hopkins, those actual rumors, the oldest that I heard, that I could find that they came about, was actually in the 1880s, right after the medical center opened its doors. And I actually found a passage in one of the books I was reading, and I wouldn't read it to you, it's too grisly for me to read out loud. But it's all hearsay and oral history or oral legend. And it was actually investigated at the time by a really well-known journalist, H.L. Mencken, who was a Baltimore Sun reporter and a great writer. Some of you who are more well-read than me probably have read some stuff by him. But he investigated at the time, found no basis for it. And it continued, and it reminds me, actually, so, you know, when I found out I was going to give this talk and I started reading the book, I felt really attacked, like, you know, oh my gosh, they're taking out the wrong people here, and I thought, oh, well, I'll just share some of the positive things that Hopkins does, and I'll talk to some of the people. You know, as I mentioned, a lot of people that work at Hopkins who are employed at Hopkins are from the neighborhood. I'll talk to some of the people I know that have benefited from this, and I'll share their story, and then everybody will be won over. So I started talking to this woman who cleans our floor on the cardiac surgery offices, and I've known her for several years. She, you know, mostly works in the evening, and I'll see her there, you know, like after I'm done with my last case. She'll come around, and she's really nice and sweet, and we strike up a conversation. And she reminds me a lot of Deborah Lax. You know, she's from the neighborhood. She doesn't have a great educational background. She's very hardworking. It's one of two jobs that she has. She works through pain and suffering from several illnesses that she has, and I really have a lot of admiration for her. And she's supporting a lot of people in her family, but her family, very demographically and socially, is very similar to the Lax family. You know, she has a son that's been in prison. She has a son that's disabled. You know, she has a lot of health problems. I mean, you know, a lot of similar issues there. And I thought, well, here's a person who's employed at Hopkins, has good health benefits, you know, has kind of, you know, gotten out of this a little bit, and, you know, see what her perspective is. And I started talking to her about it, and she was fair enough to Hopkins. She certainly doesn't complain about it as an employer, but there was a skepticism there that I could sense. And as I was talking to her, I brought up this oral legend about people being taken off the street in Broadway out by the hospital. And she believed it. She confirmed it. She reiterated it to me. And not only that, she in her mind knew of other people that worked for Hopkins, her friends who are from her kind of social demographic group that she knows that work in Hopkins, had what in their mind was confirmatory evidence this was going on. Areas of the medical center that were locked up or very high security that they weren't allowed into. Seeing large cages transported, which was probably stuff for large animal research. A lot of that's all mixed in with the hospital medical center. And so they would see these things and that would immediately fit in. Seeing psychiatric patients transported around the hospital, you know, especially anything that happened at night, they were very suspicious of. And I asked her, I said, really, do you believe that people are taken into this hospital against their will and research is performed on them? And she said yes. And it was kind of a moment of crisis for me because I had gotten to know her very well. And she kind of trusts me, and I like her, and I kind of trust her. And I had, in my mind, as I read the book about Henrietta Lacks, I thought, people always say stuff that's incorrect, and she never corrects them. She never gets them back on track, you know. She doesn't confront them with these things. You know, I think if somebody's really your friend, they should tell you when they think you're saying something that's not true. And I found myself sitting there like a deer in the headlights, and I didn't say anything. Because I thought it would break her trust for me to say, oh, you're crazy. That's not really happening. You know, and I'll continue to talk to her about that, and, you know, we'll see. But I think, you know, there's just so much polarization. You know, you're talking about a huge group of people that are really locked out of institutions and all the things that people that, you know, navigate within those institutions with ease. We're just not. We're not in touch with what they're dealing with, and we can't even imagine. So that's the basis for us. It goes back to when the hospital opened its doors. It started almost immediately. And there was a contentious relationship between Hopkins and the Baltimore community almost from the onset, because a lot of the physicians that were recruited all came from the outside. Halsted came from New York. Welch came from Philadelphia. Osler came from Canada and Philadelphia. And the local physicians who were all trained at these, you know, in local medical schools, they didn't like it. You know, and the people in the community were suspicious of it also. Another question in the back? Oh, I keep forgetting to read the questions. So I should just, should I read that question?
No.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
You mentioned that all the 10 pages that people have to either read or have somebody explain to them and sign, they might be in the middle of a heart attack. Do you think that happens abroad, especially in advanced countries?
I don't know. I know that in Europe it's probably pretty similar to the U.S. And I know you have to get consent for treatment. I don't want to over-exaggerate that too much. We don't sit there and tell people they have to read it before they sign it. Most people don't read it. I mean, I'm a physician, and my wife's a physician, and when our kids are sick, we don't try to outsmart the pediatricians or whoever's taking care of them. They tell us, you know, of course we ask about them, ask around about them to find out what kind of reputation they have, but then when we go to meet them, you know, we talk to them, we shake their hand, we establish a relationship, and when they tell us they think what's best is best, you know, we decide if we're going to go along with it or not, and we usually go along with it. And, you know, so when you go to talk to a patient about that sort of stuff, most people, they just sign it after you talk to them.
Right, but like, I think what you were saying earlier is that people who don't come from a background of education and have some kind of idea of what this is all about, people like the woman you just talked about,
Yeah.
for them to sign papers they haven't read and don't understand, that's really scary.
It is. I mean, it's an imperfect world.
Yeah.
You can't, I mean, if somebody's, you know, they have a life-threatening condition, it's not a time to address their literacy.
No, I know.
I mean, I understand your point, and it is troublesome. I mean, it tears my heart out every time I have to deal with that sort of thing. I mean, you know, we talk about this all the time. You know, do people really understand? But I'm telling you, I have an MD, PhD, and I don't understand a lot of the time, and I concede that. I do. I don't. You know, I concede that when I go to get care for my children, or you know, if I were to need it for myself. You know, I educate myself a little bit, but I don't think you can. You know, in these days with the internet, you might be able to outsmart your doctor, but it take a lot of time.
It was a concern for people that don't even know where to begin in understanding.
Yeah, I mean it's an issue, you know. But you'd be surprised about the questions they asked and the insight they have into the critical issues. That was one thing reading the book about Henrietta Lacks. Deborah Lacks asserted some very apropos. Had some great insights into the issues related to those cells. She came to the conclusion on her, or not came to the conclusion, but came to the realization on her own without anyone telling her explicitly that those were cancer cells. And, you know, that was an important thing to her. And it was important to me. As soon as I started reading the book, I was like, they're cancer cells. They're not like her normal cells. And to me, that means something. And Deborah Lacks pointed that out. And I think, you know, you don't have to be well-read or extremely literate to understand life and death issues and health and illness. It can be explained in straightforward terms. But if you're going to lay it all out for the letter of the law, it's going to take 7 pages, and you can get bogged down in the details. And that's my point.
Well, one more question,
Sorry.
and then that'll have to be it for this evening.
Yeah.
Welcome to Duluth.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That's what I want to say too, and this young man has a huge exam coming up this Saturday, I believe. So he has really done a terrific job, and good luck.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
I would like to have heard from this gentleman of color. He had his hand up.
Oh, sir. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, it was interesting, the transition from the period where training of medicine was kind of crude. I see a lot of statistics about success. Do you have any statistics about failures? For example, how many times people have to die during a surgery, something that they were doing new before they begin to get it well?
Yeah, I don't have great examples. The thing I know the most about is cardiac surgery and mortality after cardiac surgery, and I know it's come down a lot since the days when it first started. When Dr. Lillihei at the University of Minnesota reported his first outcomes using cardiopulmonary bypass for repair of congenital abnormalities, babies with abnormal hearts that had to be corrected, it was about 50% survival in those studies, and it's much higher than that today. So that was when he was first doing that. Today, it depends on the type of surgery, but all surgeries are pretty safe. And, a pretty high mortality would be in the 5 to 10% range as opposed to 50%. And most routine things can be done with a mortality of less than 1%, like repairing a simple hole between 2 chambers in the heart would probably be done with a mortality of less than 1%. Bypassing blocked blood vessels, that is one of the most studied operations there is in all of medicine and surgery in adult patients who have blockage of their blood vessels to their heart. And I don't know what the worst mortality on that ever was, but I know one of our surgeons who trained kind of early on in the field in the 80s. He was in Denver at the Denver VA, and when he went to the Denver VA and was operating there, their mortality for coronary artery bypass was about 8%, and now an accepted mortality would be more in the range of like 1% or even less for some patients on routine stuff, like 0.5%. So the expectations are much higher now. No problem.
Thank you.